Choppy Waters, three men in a boat, quite literally in a boat. I'm here with two former or retired naval officers, Dr. Chris Parry, Rear Admiral of the Royal Navy, and Chuck Farrer, who once paddled about just as well and did a bit of SEAL training and work. There you go. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. It's quite a day because we're still waiting for what is considered to be yet another form of white smoke coming probably out of the White House, because we haven't heard yet what the full outcome is of the highly anticipated call between the current leader of the free world and the man who is in charge of the Optimist in Mordor. Now, having said this, we actually want to talk about strategy, tactics, the various setups in the battlefield, but why don't we start with a general view? Dr. Chris Parry, you've been on with us, you've seen this, you've opined on this, you've highlighted what the Europeans and the Americans should do. How do you view the current situation?
Well, I think if we've been speaking 6 months ago, I'd have said that, and in fact I did say, that the world is split into two major power blocks with about 152 other countries in the middle trying to work out which way to go. And those two blocks, essentially the Eurasian autocrats of Russia, China, Iran and North Korea. And they're trying to dominate Eurasia and the waters around it, both for their collective and individual interests. So Iran was trying to dominate the greater Middle East with its axis of resistance and its potential nuclear power. North Korea is obviously trying to push on South Korea. China initially wants to dominate the India Pacific. And of course, Russia is trying to dominate predominantly the Baltic and the Black Sea, as well as the Arctic, but is now pushing much harder on Western Europe, that tiny collection of states on the end of what Russia always calls its continent. So they're opposed by what I call the maritime democracies, which are Canada, America, United Kingdom, parts of Europe, but not all of it, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and I think moving into that bloc because of all the reasons of superpower rivalry, India as well. And that will really lever on the sense that they have a rivalry with China at the geostrategic level. So, as I said, you've got 152 in-betweeners saying, well, you know, which way are we going to go? And if you look at the pattern, it's very much those that want development tend towards the Eurasian autocrats. Those that want security tend towards the maritime democracies. But there's some anomalies in that. For example, Vietnam would probably tend towards the maritime democracies because of its rivalry with China. Saudi Arabia is trying to sit on the fence. There's all sorts of issues. What's changed things is two things, notably President Trump's election and all that means for defensive alliances and coalitions in future, but also Israel's ability to break up Iran's axis of resistance, which I think is very interesting. So what comes off the back of that? Well, it seems to me that the world of what I would call, muscular nationalism, which was really associated with the Eurasian autocrats, has now spilled over into the democratic world. So you look at Netanyahu, you look at Zelensky in Ukraine, you look at Milei in Argentina, you look at Trump in America to a larger extent, you look at Giorgia Meloni in Italy as well. You're looking at this new form. And how does it manifest itself? And what I've been explaining to people recently is that two main rules have returned to the geostrategic environment. You've got the bedrock of these two blocks still existing, but the variation now is you've got this muscular nationalism. And what does that mean? And I've said you've got to go back really to the 19th century to Lord Palmerston, who said, look, no country has permanent allies or permanent enemies. it has permanent interests. And that's what countries should follow. And that's what elites tend to choose. But it's also now balanced by the Melian dialogue from the Peloponnesian Wars, which essentially says, look, and if you remember, the city of Milos said, we don't really want to pick sides between Sparta and Athens. And the Athenians said, look, that only works when you're talking about cities that are equal in power. In this sort of world, the strong do what they like and the weak do what they must. So between Palmerston and the Melian dialogue, we've got sort of what the world is like today, and we've got to get used to it. I mean, what's really interesting, for the first time in my life, about 3 months ago, I woke up thinking, well, first time in my life that America might not come to our aid if we get into trouble. I'm pretty convinced that America would fulfill its NATO obligations, as long, of course, it isn't confronting its pacing threat, which is China, and has got the spare capacity. I'm not sure the cavalry will come if they're engaged heavily in strategic competition with China. And we've got to remember that the pacing scenario is homeland security based on anti-drugs, anti-immigration. So there's not a lot left, to tell you the truth. And the Asia-Pacific region and Europe have got to look after themselves a hell of a lot better. We've been freeloading in Europe. There's no question about that. And I'm afraid that dependency has given everybody a false confidence in relation to predators like Russia and indeed China. Long answer.
No. I like that, and I would approach this. I'm not going to go right into Mackinder and Mahan and the likes, but having predicated my response, respectively, my question is, Europe, on the other hand, is anywhere, depending on how you wish to measure it, and depending whether you trust the Russian numbers, which I don't, and there's good reason as to why we shouldn't, because both GCHQ as well as the Finns and the Estonians tell us very well that the numbers are shambolic at best. But anywhere between 12 and 15 times is what we have in terms of economic power, despite the fact that Europe has performed so abysmally for the last 15 years economically. But we still have the capacity to respond if we so decide. As you quite rightly insinuated or inferred, is that Europeans have failed to actually plan, respond, and act, whereas the totalitarians and the axis of evil can more easily act. And if so, as they can more easily act and move their economies into what is seemingly necessary for them to wage war and fight us, both kinetically, peer-to-peer, asymmetrically, it doesn't matter, to fight their war. And Russia invests, by the way, as we understand, about 1/10 of the Russian economic output is currently invested in what can only be described as asymmetric warfare, including propaganda. That's astonishing in terms of numbers.
Well, I mean, I think, we've got to get realistic here. The Eurasian autocrats are helping each other. And you're looking in China at an economy on a scale that America had it in 1940-41 and can gear it up to war making. Conversely, you look at America, it has an equivalent debt to the debt it had at the end of World War II in relative terms. So we're going to start a war with a country that Yamamoto would have feared in China, and fighting against a coalition that is headed by a country whose debts exceed that of what they had at the end of World War II. This is not great. And the other thing is, the Russians don't have to invade in the West. They just have to smash things. And if they get their missile, what I worry about in all of this is if you get a frozen peace in Ukraine, you've got a very large army on your hands with nothing to do. And Putin will not want that army returning to Russia. And I suspect what he will do, he'll either put it, in fact, he could do both. He'll reinforce what we used to associate with the Wagner operations in Africa. He'll reinforce that. And also, he's going to put extreme pressure on Sweden and Finland for daring to join NATO while he was engaged in Ukraine. That also fulfills another objective, which, of course, claws some influence back in the Baltic region, which, of course, he's lost completely. except for Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg, as a result of what he's done in Ukraine. So if we remember that the twin neuroses of Russia are always the Baltic and the Black Sea, he has to neutralize what he perceives to be the threat coming from the Baltic.
But neither has he been able to strengthen his capabilities thus far in the north, because he still has the festering wound as he perceives it, or the Oprichnina perceives it in Ukraine. They haven't won anything in Ukraine, quite literally. And
actually, forgive me, they got a fifth of Ukrainian territory.
But they haven't won anything. Germany in the Second World War seemed to have done a lot in Northern Africa, and Americans and Monty managed to simply actually annihilate them after all. And then the logistic situation, which you fortunately managed to overcome by retaining Malta and shall we say, eradicating what was left of the Italian Navy, and say you managed to actually precipitate all these efforts. So the adventure in Northern Africa is like the adventure in Ukraine. It didn't succeed there. And the logistics for Ukraine are not looking good at the moment for Russia. As I understand, the Russians have lost more than 16,000 trucks over the last 3 years. How difficult will it be for them to keep up the logistics, given the fact that they're running out of money? Will the Chinese bring them the trucks which they need?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think we underestimate the extent to which the four members of the axis of resistance or evil, or whatever you want to call it, are helping each other right now. And the Chinese economy will be only too glad to produce all those trucks in return. If we're looking for analogies, Axel, I think the analogy in Ukraine is very much the First World War, with Germany sitting on northern France, eastern France, and Belgium. And it was always up to Britain and France and America eventually, of course, to force the Germans out of those territories. Now, without the assistance of anybody else, the Ukrainians are not going to be able to force the Russians out of those territories. And you're absolutely right. In the First World War, of course, if you ask any German what caused the collapse of Germany, it wasn't defeats on the Western Front. It was actually the blockade. There is scarcely a German between 1918 and 1920 that didn't tell you that the Royal Navy, actually, and the French Navy won the First World War. I'm very fond of saying to our army whenever I'm at seminars and conferences, the army simply fixed the enemy, while actually the Navy defeated Germany as a country. And when you've got more than 100,000 people dying of starvation and malnutrition at the end of the war in Germany, it tells you where the point of effort is. Now, you're never going to be able to blockade Russia, because they're being helped by Iran, China, and anybody else, who's prepared to take money and oil. The easiest way to bring Russia to its knees right now is to depress the price of oil and get the Saudis and everybody else to produce much more oil right now, get the spot price down, introduce a real panic in terms of the macroeconomy in Russia. That is how to do it. And I think that is President Trump's card if President Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table and take it seriously.
By the way, can I say this, Chuck, before you jump in?
Yes, please. Please do.
Chris is... Rear Admiral, you are, of course, completely correct, because Canaris, Reda, Hoffman all stated the very same thing. They agreed on one thing, that the logistics, and therefore the supplies, and therefore the impact of the blockade made 1918 the crucible which the Germans could not fight out of on the Western Front, which is why the American impetus, the steadfastness of the French and the British troops actually wore them down and treated them, despite the fact that they moved all those troops from the east to the west. But if you can't, the German word is
Does it have 26 syllables?
Ohne Mampf kein Kampf. Without food, no fight. And this is That's what right. happened. And the Royal Navy was exceptionally effective in that regard.
Yeah, having said that, of course, they tried to mirror image that to us. And of course, there was a period in 1917 where Jackie Fisher said, the Army is going to have to win this for us before the Navy loses it. And certainly before we introduced the convoy system, and, Jellicoe, of course, was heading for a nervous breakdown at this point. And if it hadn't been for David Lloyd George coming in as Prime Minister and insisting on the convoy being adopted, then Britain itself would have been in serious trouble at that point. In fact, my great-grandfather's brother was killed in April 1917, actually bringing a merchant ship across the Atlantic, and was torpedoed at a time when it was the height of the U-boat tonnage sinking in World War One. So yeah, I've got skin in that game. But yeah, we can extend this. We've got people bleating at the moment about the Israelis blockading Gaza. It's a well-known and well-practiced principle of war that you can actually win wars strategically without having to sacrifice too many of your people tactically by imposing a blockade. And somehow in 2025, something that's been going on for thousands of years is somehow illegitimate. It's extraordinary.
I absolutely agree with your analogy of leaning on Belgium and France at that point in World War One. I am extremely skeptical, but besides their material and manpower superiority, and I don't mean quality of material, just number of stuff, I don't see Russia ever getting to the Dnipro River. I
agree with that, Chuck. They'll hang on now.
Absolutely. But I was fascinated and delighted because normally I'm the only Navy guy on one of these things, and I was delighted to hear bringing sea power into it and blockades and the effect they have on food and economics and everything else that drives war. But I see those same cards on the table. Russia is not a blue water navy. Russia has its trade constrained by the Baltic Sea, which their geopolitical mistakes have turned into a lake. The Black Sea, critical to their perceived prosperity, they've lost control of it to a nation that doesn't have a navy. And we were on, Axel and I, speaking with Jason Smart just a week or so ago. Russia's economic well-being seems to be hanging on their operation of 1,500 or so, 400 to 1,500 shadow tankers that are badly manned, uninsured, unqualified captains. And I boldly stated, and I think I'm right about this, U.S. and NATO naval special warfare could, in a matter of a week, seize every one of those vessels on the high seas. I keep wondering when Mr. Putin is going to see all of these specters whirling around his campfire. He can be unplugged. Do you think so, sir? I mean,
Yeah. There's an easier way to do it, Chuck. You just impose secondary sanctions, and you say if you trade with Russia on this basis, then we sanction you. It's as simple as that. This is what's been hovering. I mean, my view is that President Trump's been quite smart here. He's reeled Putin in. He's showing Putin to be pretty obdurate about, and also playing hard to get as well. And he's going to come straight back. He's going to impose secondary sanctions, and he's also going to arm Ukraine to the teeth if he has to. And that will totally rock the Putin regime if that's the case. Because as you say, they're hanging on. But what they can do is they can sit on this ground that they've got and say, well, push us off. And I don't currently believe the Ukrainians have the capacity or sustainability to be able to do that without the, another country or other countries coming in to help them. We're frozen in that conflict right now, as far as I can see. And nothing is going to make the Russians withdraw from what they've got, short of armed force.
I agree.
They will, they'll basically destroy everything in those occupied oblasts rather than give it up. And, that's their history. I tell you, I was listening to a lecture in Russian about 2 months ago, and the audience said, general, they're talking to some general, and the general was giving a presentation on Ukraine, and they asked, how are we going to win in Ukraine? And the general simply said, we're going to throw corpses at it. And they all got up and clapped.
Okay, well then let's turn this in, because we had a discussion with Mick Ryan on Friday, Brisbane time, and prior to that, I had a chat with a number of our friends, Finnish, Estonian, Ukrainian military on various levels, and they say that essentially they can already see, and the Estonians and the Finns don't use the word sense. It's not that they sense something, sniff something. They just say it is, or they see it, or they can see it behind the ridge. That's if you translate it. And they say they can see it behind the ridge, that the Russian logistics have become so fragile, so intermittent, so thin, that if the Ukrainians continue to to really harass them, if they continue to innovate and extend the range of their mid to long range drones by another 5 to 10 kilometers, which is highly likely that they will do so probably by the time we air this. And as you quite rightly say and highlight, have Western support for ordnance and the likes, they can make a significant difference. They also say that the key thing, I know this will hurt you, Chuck, and I'm sorry, Rear Admiral Parry, but they also say that the only thing which will give them the punch power to get rid of the Russians is air power. They say wherever they've used the F-16s, wherever the Mirage are in play, they make headway, they suppress the Russians, they push them back, they annihilate the Russian troops in a significant fashion, which would highlight yet again that the doctrine which we once had in combined arms in the West is actually working, and air supremacy matters a great deal.
Yeah, it does. If I were Ukraine right now, I would devastate Sevastopol. That is how I would lever this, because Sevastopol would then become the Syracuse of the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War. The Russians would have to, for all sorts of reasons, try and save and reinforce Sevastopol. It's got such totemic value for them. It's got a lot of military resources. It is absolutely the heart of this conflict. And I would put all my resources into isolating and basically devastating Sevastopol. Now, that's probably a war crime even to mention that or even think about it. But to tell you the truth, that is the center of gravity for this whole campaign. If the Russian hold on Sevastopol becomes unsustainable, it will have a ripple effect, I suspect, all the way up to Rostov-on-Don. And you'll see the progressive collapse, I suspect, of the Russian army. The Ukrainians had their chance, about 18 months ago. If they'd been able to drive south through those hastily prepared defenses to hit the Sea of Azov, really cut that in half. They didn't have the assault forces or the engineering capacity to get through the obstructions and mines that were there. But if they'd been able to split the Russian forces then, at a time when Putin himself was under serious threat from a series of coup plotters in the Kremlin at the time, Patrushev and co., about the time of the Prigozhin attempt to save Putin from himself. If they'd have driven through to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea then, it would have been game over. So you have to induce another, what I call ripple effect. The only way to do that, I think, is to really, really concentrate on Sevastopol.
And, during this, we've just been speaking of the Russian logistic apparatus. We see motorcycles, electric scooters, donkeys, etc. And the Russians are in the easiest position they can be regarding logistics. You have a static line and you are feeding bullets and beans and Band-Aids up to it. there's no doubt that this logistic machine is going to fall apart, and it will collapse in the face of combined arms maneuver warfare. Should the Ukrainians be equipped to do that? And as Axel was just mentioning, power comes from the top down. You've got air parity at least, and I can see this whole Russian endeavor, this whole apparatus falling apart with blows like you were just talking, driving to the Sea of Azov. I think it's brilliant what you said about Sevastopol. It is the blue chip on the table. Crimea is what Putin needs. So take it away from him. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Drop the bridge and hammer them. I'm sorry, sir.
No, it's all right. I've always thought that is the key that unlocks this, that brings him in. That's why I say I think President Trump, if he combines the secondary sanctions with, then it then starts to bring Putin in to say, well, look, we could have the army on a back foot here, the logistics. I mean, the other thing we haven't mentioned, which everybody knows about, is how corrupt the system is. It's not just a bad logistics system. It is so corrupt. I've seen reports on Russian social media. I mean, my favorite story is right at the start of the campaign, is where you had a battalion commander claiming he had 710 men. And he was claiming the pay and the stores and all the allowances to 710. He only had 80, apparently. And so when they ordered this lot to attack, obviously the brigade HQ thought, oh, we got 700 men. Let's have a 700-man attack. Well, of course, there's only 80, but then the CO then claimed that he'd taken 620 casualties, which is why he only had 70 left. Well, they shot him in the end, I hear, because everybody found out. But that told me the level of corruption. And we've heard all the time of oil stores, food, being sold to local populations. My real worry is that we get to a situation where the Russian army starts living off the land and starts consuming all the resources of those oblasts on which they sit. And it becomes a wasteland. It becomes a humanitarian crisis. And we have total anarchy and chaos. And the Russians think like the Romans used to. We create a desolation and we can call it peace.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is what is called Russian occupation. I mean, I'm sitting here, as you know, the shores of Lake NATO, and we just had the Leonard Meri conference here. We're about 172 kilometers away from the beginning of Mordor. So we do know we actually have not only remembrance, but live action memories by many, many people here who survived that, respectively, who even came back from Siberia to live their last few years of life here in free Estonia. The same thing applies to people in Finland, all across the Baltics, Poland, Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. So it's worth fighting for from our perspective. And the reason why I'm highlighting this, when you said the core, and we've discussed this many times over, Ben Hodges, Philip Breedlove, they've been stressing this for as long as I have listened to them, that Crimea in the Black Sea is the absolute linchpin. It's the most important strategic asset there is. But at the same time, holding Crimea is also a moral obligation. Chuck and I wrote about this, that there's a necessity to free Crimea because the Crimean Tatars have been exposed to genocide by Russia, Russian Tsars, the Bolsheviks, and now the current operation of Putin's Russia yet again. There is absolutely no reason why we should not help Ukraine defend itself and free itself from this annexation. There's also no reason why we should not help Ukraine defend itself against Russia to retain the occupied territories as such, because there's currently, if I'm not quite mistaken, the number of this morning is 1,790 Russian soldiers are registered POWs, or they were as of Friday, I'm sorry. 408 were designated to be exchanged already. Then there's the number of 1,000. What have the Russians said? The Russians said that they want to split the number of human beings they exchange for their soldiers from both Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians from the occupied territories, and now it comes children.
Well, this is terrorist activity. This is what Hamas does. So, this is, I mean, I think what we've got to be careful about is we separate the liberation of Ukraine from regime change in Russia. It gets very, very dangerous if the regime itself is threatened. We have to get a regime in Russia, whether it's Putin or basically some of his court, that actually deliver this. But regime change in Russia will start all sorts of issues, like a NATO nation being attacked because they need to have the pretext for extreme measures, all those sorts of things. So we've got to be very careful how we go here. I'm very impatient with people who say, well, if you get rid of Putin, then the Ukraine war's over. That's not the case. There is a well-established, what I call selectorate rather than an electorate in Russia that will just continue in the same style, at the same pace, because at the end of the day, it still delivers the goodies for about 350,000 people in Russia. As long as that's the case, you're going to see very little policy change. However, if you convince them that it's in their interests, it's business, it's not personal, then they will see sense. But if we threaten regime change in Russia as a result of the Ukraine war, it will get tasty, I think. And then we're going to have to start talking about, tactical nuclear weapons and things like that.
So essentially what you're saying is that secondary sanctions and everything which we do on the economic side, they cannot resist as easily. They cannot portray to their own electorate or to their own fiefdom as such an, say, direct attack. This is more difficult to explain, but at the same time, it takes away the power they wield.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think we've got to be very careful about destabilizing the regime. Only a coherent regime can deliver what we need in Ukraine. That's my point. When I speak to Russians, academics and people who are out of the country, the one thing they fear is everything falling apart, and they will do anything and support anyone who will hold it all together. They've all got memories of the 1990s. They've also got memories of what happens when the strong center folds and it becomes very anarchic. And the Russians do to themselves what they do to other people when they get the chance. It's a nasty environment. So what we mustn't do, of course, is get in a situation where Russia itself is in danger of collapse. We do need a coherent authority to deliver what it is we want in Ukraine.
What are the chances that it is so much worse than we understand it? I mean, we had the Wagner mutiny. What amazed me watching that unfold is there was not a single Russian soldier who stood out in the road, put their hand up and said, "You're not going to pass." Everybody let it happen.
Yeah, Chuck, I think we've got the wrong story on this. And the way I read it, just feeling my way around Russian social media right now, is that Prigozhin recognized that the power was shifting in the Kremlin. And I think for about 3 or 4 months, Putin was in danger of a coup. It was about a year, 15 months into the Ukraine war. And I think there was a clique around him. And I'm fingering Patrushev and his son. And I think maybe Shoigu, maybe even Gerasimov. You just don't hear about them nowadays, really. Right. And I think there was a potential coup inbound. And the way I read the Prigozhin mutiny, it wasn't against Putin. It was designed to rescue Putin from this clique, which is why everybody was so disabled. Putin wasn't able to act because Prigozhin's his man. There's no question about it. He was losing contracts that had been taken away from him with regard to the armed forces. He had all sorts of cash flow and asset problems. But the key issue, and if you read the words very carefully, what Prigozhin says, he was there to rescue the Tsar, if you like, Putin, from these evil counselors. And I think that paralysis, Chuck, is down to the fact that nobody was there to authorize any sort of action against him. And when Putin was asked, Putin didn't want to do anything about Prigozhin at that point. And if you ask me who killed Prigozhin in the end, it's the Siloviki, it's the ex-KGB GRU types who are still hanging around, but actually were in the ascendant back then.
That will probably take a little bit of time for us to finally find out, unless, of course, somebody somewhere in Maryland finally releases what we know about their phone calls, but we probably will not ever hear this, especially not in the current environment where we have Miss Gabbard as the ODNI. But there you go.
Well, you'll never know if you're relying on the Army of Northern Virginia, that's for sure.
No, but the good thing is, technically, GCHQ should have picked up these bits and pieces, and Mr. Starmer, of all people, should know. But then again, no. we're not gonna go there tonight because I think we're both equally disenchanted. Having said this, now the Russians can't really win in Ukraine unless they just stay there and manage, as you said, living off the land, throw people at it, try to attrit the other side and live longer than the other side. This is the worst part of their strategies. It hasn't always worked in their history, by the way. One has to highlight this. There's a number of wars which they've lost the longer they went because they somehow always ran out of money. No surprise. So if we were to find a way to attrit the economics, how would you see a Russian collapse impact the Russian army in the field? Assume the Russians now see the oil price go down another $8 to $10, be it deliberately through secondary sanctions or be it just by means of the market actually turning against them. What happens? How does it work?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to look at the strength of this sort of Eurasian autocratic agreement. And I think just as if there were a collapse in Iran, and I think it is coming in Iran within the next 2 years, I think you're going to find that China will ride to the rescue here. And it's not in China's interest for Russia to collapse, or indeed for the Russian army to collapse. And what I think you would see is very, very heavy economic and also practical support from China to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Okay. All righty. Chuck, you had a follow-up question.
Well, it was actually to express my appreciation of your grasp of the situation regarding this lines of command within the Russian military as the coup was unfolding, who may have actually appeared powerful, who was powerful, who wasn't. I mean, you've got you have spent time there, you speak the language, you have been behind the curtain. And very often people like myself who watch the war very carefully, and, when I first entered the big game, look, the Cold War was on. I was operating in Europe against Soviet proxy terrorist groups. And there was a point in my career as a young naval officer where I firmly thought my son and grandchildren would be fighting the Soviet Union. Just how much it has changed.
It could be.
You're right, if they stick around. But what do you see? Should the unthinkable happen, and I share your fear as well, if the center collapses there, what are some of the follow-on horrors that you foresee?
That's a good question, Chuck. Yeah, I mean, if the center collapses in Moscow, then it breaks down into feudal fiefdoms, basically. The governors of each province will take charge, I suspect, and the real power will lie in the hands of the military district commanders and the allegiance that they actually bring towards them. Obviously, a lot of our views are centered on St. Petersburg, Moscow, Ekaterinburg, places like that. But you know, what I detect that there's quite a lot of localism growing up at the moment in terms of resilience. We've got to remember that Russia's 10 time zones wide. It's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
incredibly it incredibly needs a strong center if it's going to survive as as an entity. You only have to go to the east and you see how many Chinese guest workers there are in what they call Outer Manchuria, by the way. You and I call
Yes.
it Siberia, Vladivostok, Sakhalin, and places like that. And if you look at the standard map that China issued 2.5 years ago, Outer Manchuria actually is shown as part of China, just as Taiwan is. So there's some real tensions there. Now, my sense is it would break down into regional fiefdoms. And I sense, and I'll use the non-Finnish word here, I sense that quite a lot of governors are preparing for that. I mean, I personally think that the next head of Russia will be the governor of Tula province, Alexei Dumin. He's the guy you never ever see. He hasn't fallen out of a window yet, and
Mhm.
he's always there and thereabouts. And if he manages to throw Ukraine out of the cursed salient, I think we can call it that again now,
Mhm.
then he will get a lot of credit with the powers that be and will go forward on that momentum. But of course, now I've mentioned him, he doesn't need to be in a high-rise block anytime soon.
But he is in close. He has worked in close collaboration with Sanchik and Medvedev, so that's
Yeah,
why he has a power base which is different than others. Medvedev and Sanchik both have had significant roles within the war of aggression against Ukraine, both siege of
yeah,
Mariupol, capture of Avdiivka, the likes. Sanchik being appointed for the Southern Military Command, and they are all within one group of people who have trained together, worked together, and seemingly have also joint economic interests, which, gosh almighty, that is the ultimate Russian story, is it not?
It's like
yeah.
ancient Rome.
But at the end of the day, I mean, those of us, who understand the ethics of the film The Godfather and the death of Stalin, know that it's never the obvious one that actually emerges. It's somebody who can orchestrate that and keep everybody happy.
May I ask a strictly naval question here?
Yeah.
Of course, it is another one of those things circling the firelight here. I can remember when my father was a destroyer captain and was in charge of the Taiwan Straits patrols. And when I was a boy, he would tell me about Chinese missile boats sortieing against him, et cetera. Here's a great question to ask an admiral, because as a SEAL, I see completely different sides of the war. But I try to imagine what actually it's going to take for China to invade Taiwan. And I bring this point up. I don't know that China, even though it has the largest navy on earth, I'm not sure it could launch and maintain an amphibious operation in Taiwan. Now, I may be completely wrong, but I see a vastly target-rich environment in the Straits, and I see NATO submarines, and I see converging U.S. carrier battle groups. I don't know that China is up to it yet. Granted, they will have considerable land-based aviation assets. They have ship-killing ballistic missiles, but I'd love to get the War College dump from you. Show us your lights on this.
Yeah, the Chinese don't have to invade Taiwan; they just have to blockade it, and you then invite the free world to break the blockade, and then you apply all the mass that you have. I'm skeptical about the number of warships they've got at the moment, Chuck. The reason they've got a lot of warships is that steel right now is cheap, and they've got a lot of shipbuilding labor that's unemployed. You've got a lot of youth unemployment, so they're having to employ it. So I don't think that a lot of those ships are manned with what I would call trained manpower.
Mm-hmm.
They are certainly trying
agree.
to frighten the Taiwanese. They built these huge mulberry barges, which become piers, as you know, that they're planning to take across. But here's the thing. You don't need to fight China in its backyard. You need to fight China anywhere they are on the surface of the planet. And I did a war game recently where I had to come up with the plan to stop them invading. And I said, right, it's very simple. We're not going to fight this. We simply say to China, if you invade Taiwan, the day after, every single container with Chinese produced goods in it stops. Because we have the power to do that throughout the world. And the Chinese have got hold of that, and that's why they're building up their navy to go blue ocean, is because they can see the threat to. I've always said, the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web, and if you interrupt that, China's economy will tank. And give it 3 weeks of tanking, you've got social unrest, which is the number 2 threat that the Communist Party won't put up with. Number 1 threat, of course, is the survival of the party being sort of compromised. Those 2 things, you get instant change of direction, or indeed you get war, depending on the way they want to be. But no, I don't see them invading Taiwan. I see a blockade, and as I said, my real worry, Chuck, is that the American Navy in particular falls for the same trick that the Japanese tried to play. If you remember, if you exclude Pearl Harbor, the idea was the Japanese would attrit the US Navy as it came across the Pacific. They'd have a final sort of Tsushima type battle with your battle fleet, and it would be game over. Pearl Harbor interrupted that plan, and of course completely threw them, because having destroyed your battleships, they then said, oh crikey, the Americans are now building aircraft carriers. We never saw that happening. And your carrier fleet of 114 carriers won the Pacific War for you. So it's interesting to see how that goes, but be in no doubt, given the mass the Chinese have, it would be an absolute bloodbath there. So we don't have to fight there. We can fight elsewhere against China. And as I said, all you've got to do is say to China, this is what we're going to do. Anytime you want to try it, then we'll get on with it. There's a final point. It's not the United States Navy against China. It's the free world.
Yes.
And Admiral Mike Mullen, a few years ago, came up with a fantastic idea, which still applies today. He said, if you look at the free world, it's got 1,000 warships. He called it a 1,000-ship navy. That's what we should be doing now, is saying, look, China, you are a threat to world peace. If you threaten Taiwan, we are going to put together a 1,000-ship navy to oppose you. And even you can't build that fast. And you certainly can't man and operationalize warships the world over just yet. So that's what I think we do, is we say, we will control. We're back to the start here, Axel. I'm a great believer we are in a Mackinder, Mahanian, Spikeman world right now. You've got the Eurasian autocrats doing the Mackinder thing. You've got the maritime democracies doing the Mahanian thing, and all the conflict is taking place in Rimland, which is the bit between the two. And, in fact, I wrote a paper for this for our defense review in 2019. And Spikeman's Rimland is basically Afghanistan, it's Ukraine, it's the axis of resistance, it's Taiwan. This is Spikeman. And, those ghosts from the 20th century are now made flesh. And so as long as we dominate the world ocean, we can leave them dominating the world island. It doesn't really matter as long as they stay out of Western Europe. We don't care.
I need to get you over here to now be the Joint Commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because I love the way, as a special warfare officer, I love the way you think. Never fight the fight they want you to fight. Fight
exactly
where they don't want to fight, or they can't. Absolutely.
Well, they haven't even thought of fighting, Chuck. That's the point. Can I just add one other thing? Is one thing that's going to break on us soon that I think people are going to really be surprised at, is the extent to which we're going to move into a battle space in space soon. I can't underestimate the link between maritime and space in the next 10 years. I've just been reading today about a Chinese basically big aeroplane, a mothership that's going to have 100 drones in it and about 20 JDAM equivalents. It's going to cruise around deploying these things. And it's got a range of 7,000 miles. And people were falling over themselves, saying, "Oh, this is wonderful. It's game changing." I said, "No, it isn't. We simply hit it with a laser from space. Goodbye."
Right
Start
on.
thinking on a different level. It's crazy. And
I thought the same thing.
People are just, yeah. Did you see it, Chuck?
I did see that, and I was thinking, it's a great, wonderful thing, but it's as defenseless as an airliner. And so you put this thing, you send it halfway to Pearl Harbor and let those drones. Well, it's not going to get halfway to Pearl Harbor. But
And Stavridis, Admiral Stavridis, agrees with both of you in this regard, and he has highlighted that the defense of the freedom of navigation will in future only be safe if we are capable in space.
Mm-hmm. Everything
let
goes
me give you a little
down.
spoiler on that. Let me give you a spoiler on that. I mean, we always say that geography is history here, and I just want to give you a view. We're probably going to have nuclear fusion by the 2040s.
Yes.
And just think what would happen if the Eurasian autocrats were able to grid the whole of Eurasia using nuclear fusion. The sea suddenly becomes a lot less important, to tell you the truth, because quite a lot of that oil and gas and all the other things that go by sea ain't going to go by sea anymore. They don't need to. If you've got a lot of fusion produced electricity and you're gridding whole continents in future, same goes to the United States, then we totally change the dynamic of the Mahanian-Mackinder sort of side of things, and Mackinder becomes very important in those circumstances, and so does the amount of territory.
Which is why then what we in German call Abstandswaffen, weapons with which you can create distance, become ever more important, and the long-range drones, which we now see being developed, will be very much supplemental to the air power which we need in order to make sure that people don't come across the border, right?
That's exactly right. And, but in fact, you've brought up an interesting point there, is that, I'm a great believer now that future warfare is going to be about light footprint, heavy impact. And we're going to be doing destruction from distance instead of, close in combat in future. And again, space will play a part in that. I think the other interesting thing is, underground has become the new stealth, just as undersea is a stealthy environment. Underground, you look at Gaza, you look at what's been happening in Ukraine, it's all underground now. And to get away from drones, to reduce your signature, to reduce your vulnerabilities in terms of detection and attack, we're going to have to go underground quite significantly now. There's no question about that. Quite a lot of our infrastructure, nodal points are going to have to go underground, and it's something we're going to have to learn. I mean, I was seeing a really good article the other day saying, look, if you were fighting in cities now, you'd use underground car parks to shield your artillery and your drones. And when you got targeting, you come out, and when it's all over the firing sequence, you simply go down, underground Walmart or Waitrose again. The enemy would say, well, where did that come from?
You need to come and join me with our colleagues in Helsinki. Because they have, seriously, their total defense concept for the population and their urban defense as well as their regional node defense is based on having underground provisioning and safety for both the civilian population as well as their military and their logistics. There is a massive underground setup.
Well, look at Israel. Israel's
Yes.
the same. I mean, this is the shape of the future. We are. I mean, I was talking to my Canadian friends. Toronto has vast sort of complexes of shops and things underground, really, to escape the ice and snow in winter. And I suspect Finland's in the same case. But it is the shape of the future. We're going to be in a world in 5 years' time where everything and everyone on this planet is going to be detectable. And if you're detectable, you're targetable. And with hypersonic missiles, that means, I was working out the other day while I was in the States that within 1 hour of decision, you can actually hit anything anywhere in the world with hypersonics. That's
You
quite
need to be very,
significant.
which also means for decision makers in future, they have to be alert. They have to be fit. Many of them cannot be 80 years plus.
Well, to put
Well, hang on, I was
forward
hoping
your,
to be employed in that time.
I'm bringing you over, so you're coming.
Not everyone is as fit as you, Rear Admiral.
But something you said regarding gridding and the likely revolution of fusion, and I agree, it's coming. We may be rapidly converging to this point where it doesn't matter if you have a hypersonic missile or any sort of ballistic missile. With that much power available, every nation with a laser-based weapons, because one of the problems now simply is power, wattage, megawattage, that even those sorts of weapons are going to become obsolete. And as much as I detest Russia's Poseidon death tidal wave making machine, because again, my father was a professor of tactics at the War College, ASW. I imagine this Russian contraption going 85 knots underwater, and you simply get in front of it with an SH-60 and a nuclear depth charge, and it's over. But those sorts of sub-ROSA weapons, as you just mentioned, underground and undersea being interchangeable. Wow.
Yeah.
Normally we don't have guests on that make me think into next decade, but you'd certainly do.
Thank you, Chuck. People accuse me of being a pessimist, but actually I'm an optimist who worries a lot. It's it's quite interesting what you say, Chuck, because one of the things I've posited recently is if you put nuclear powered lasers up into space, the whole hypersonic and ballistic missile thing falls off the table, because as soon as they enter the exo atmosphere, you're taking them out. So the whole thing I think is going to change. So we're in the process now of renewing our nuclear deterrent in the United Kingdom. And I posed the question. I said, are ballistic missiles going to be valid in the same way for the whole of the life of these submarines? Maybe not.
It even calls into...
My own view is that we're going to move soon to... Do you remember these things called rods from God?
Yes, absolutely.
That came up in the 1970s, whereby, missiles based in space. That's the next frontier, I think, is you're going to be hit from the exo atmosphere.
Weren't there some Russian fractal bombing platforms back in the day?
Yeah.
I always credited those reports, and that being a space station with droppable nukes that the Russians put in.
Yeah, it was conceptualized, mind you. Having said that, in the early days, in the 1950s, they envisaged flying very large bombers into skyscrapers. That sound familiar?
I want to tell you, after 9/11, and I listened to our Secretary of State actually say, no one could have perceived this threat when my colleagues and I had been jumping out of commercial airliners for 10 years. And we did that simply to prove that we weren't even willing to sacrifice ourselves. We would simply take over the airplane, set its flight controls, and jump out the back. So
that's
you're right.
Yeah.
The threat was there.
I mean, the real problem, it's like all these things. I don't believe in black swans. I keep saying to people, there are enough grey cygnets around. If you actually bring them all together, their mum always turns up.
Well, here's something and you are the guy to ask. How do we, by that I mean mostly you, how do you get your very accurate, very well-informed perceptions into the head of leadership? I mean, how do we get them to see some of the things that are going on? And I only say we because my own modest contributions here, I wrote the Weapons of Mass Destruction annex to the National Counterterrorism Plan. And when I first sent that in, the FBI was saying, this can't happen, this can't happen, this can't happen. It's all happened. Everything has happened, including the ricin threats.
I agree. Chuck, whenever I present something that is radical, I always say, look, there are two things apply. I said, this sort of thing is like the sun. It hits a couple of people at 9 o'clock in the morning. By midday, it's hitting everybody, and nobody's surprised that it's a sunny day. So some people get the insight early on. The second thing is that if you analyze, and I think, I've got a doctorate in psychology, if you look at most military and civil incompetence, it is never a failure of intelligence, it's a failure of imagination. Arthur Conan Doyle in Silver Blaze, which is a Sherlock Holmes story, said something really important. He said, when you've excluded the impossible, anything else, however improbable, is actually possible. And I'm afraid to say that most people exclude things that they think in their experience is impossible. And by that token, they actually discard what is possible. I'm not a great believer in risk-based approaches. I believe in vulnerability-based approaches. I would say a risk-based approach is basically a clipboard and a mistake about to happen. I'll give you an example from the First World War. The Germans had two major warships called the Goeben and the Breslau in the Mediterranean. And the British Navy said, right, okay, we don't want them to interfere with the troop transports coming into France from North Africa. And so at the start of, just before the war, they sent two battle cruisers down to mark them, more than enough to deal with essentially a German battle cruiser and a cruiser. And they said, well, look, if we sit in the Western Mediterranean, they're not going to be able to exit the Mediterranean because we'll guard the Straits of Gibraltar. So we've got it covered. There's no problem. Well, the problem was the Germans realized this and said, well, okay, what can we do here? Well, actually, what we'll do is we'll offer them to the Turks because the Brits failed to deliver two dreadnoughts, which they were building to Turkey. The Turks aren't very happy about it. We'll let the Turks use the Goeben and the Breslau in the Black Sea, and perhaps Turkey will come in on our side. Well, that's exactly what happened. Turkey did come in on the side of Germany and Austro-Hungary. They took the Goeben and the Breslau. All the German officers dressed up in fezzes. They were manned by Germans. They bombarded the Russians in the Black Sea, and two British battle cruisers went. How did they do that? Simply because the planners failed to consider all the possibilities because they thought it was impossible in their thinking, and therein lies the problem. To tell the truth, Chuck, we touched on this earlier. I spent my life in tactical and operational actions thinking, what is my opponent not able to conceive what I can do, and then do it, and it succeeded every time. So the answer, look, that's a long answer, but the short answer to your question is, I always say to people I'm trying to convince, and I've learned this since I've nearly been sacked in every rank doing this. I've said, I only want you to bring your imagination to this briefing. I will bring the intelligence.
Well, you and I might be the only officers I know. My own training is in clinical psychology as well, which has served me well and maybe got me into the same kind of trouble. And my whole training is you put this problem on the table, as you know, and we are supposed to come with completely out of the box solutions. And the fact that I'm still here talking is that generally it worked. Though sometimes it didn't work.
Chuck, the real secret is to make them think it's their idea.
Yep. That was rolling in my head as well.
Yeah. Yep. That's the real secret. I've learned that as I've got older, is that actually nobody likes the guy with good ideas.
Yeah. Good ideas they get strangled in cul-de-sacs. And I have done the same thing. And as soon as possible, I try to say it was your idea. And there's that moment, of course, it's mendacity and it's an outright lie, but once you let them take control of it, then you become their acolyte. Right. You know that. Look, I'd like to be an operator, but I had to be a staff officer as well. And then you'd be a pet seal on someone's staff, which is the ultimate status symbol.
Degradation.
Degradation, absolutely. And my friends come up to me and go, "What are you doing? You're on this staff. What are you doing?"
Yeah. Anyway, there we go. So as long as we're happy, that's fine, and we're still alive. That's good too. I was saying to somebody the other day who was complaining that he didn't get a medal in a campaign. I said, "Look, the best medal you can wear is your life. Believe me. Just think about that."
Yeah, exactly. But Napoleon did say, if you can get a man to charge a cannon for a piece of ribbon, you should give him the piece of ribbon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Do you think about it in that terms? You're really going to trade your life for something that cost 89 cents at the exchange?
I can do a better deal than that.
Good deals for good seals.
Anyway. Yeah.